Saint Teresa saw the bleeding wounds in a marriage where trust was broken beyond repair. She did not write about marriage the way people expect a mystic to. She wrote about it the way a surgeon writes about a wound: cold, precise, devastating. Teresa of Avila, born in 1515 in the walled city of Avila, in the heart of Castile, Spain, spent decades writing about the human soul and what breaks it. And one of the things she kept returning to was this: that betrayal between two people who swore before God to love each other was not just a personal tragedy, it was a spiritual wound that bled in ways that could not be seen with the eyes. A wound that, if left untended, did not just destroy a marriage, it destroyed the soul that lived inside it. And she knew exactly what she was talking about. Because Teresa of Avila had watched a marriage begin destroying someone she loved before she was old enough to understand why. She had grown up inside the wreckage. She had studied it from a distance of 3 feet, and then again from a distance of 30 years. And what she eventually wrote about it shook her confessors, silenced her critics, and produced some of the most precise descriptions of interior damage that the 16th century, or any other century, ever put to paper. This is not a simple love story. This is not spiritual decoration. This is a documented account pulled directly from Teresa's own writings, from her autobiography, known as the Book of Her Life, completed in 1565 under orders from her confessor, from the Way of Perfection, written in 1566, specifically for the nuns of her first Reformed convent in Avila, and from the hundreds of letters she sent between 1560 and 1582, letters now preserved in the Carmelite archives in Rome, and analyzed in careful scholarly detail by the theologian Kieran Kavanagh in his critical edition published by the Institute of Carmelite Studies in Washington in 1976. What Teresa saw in broken marriages was not metaphor. It was spiritual anatomy. It was a clinical map of what happens inside a person when the person who was supposed to be their anchor breaks the anchor on purpose and expects the drowning to stay quiet about it. Once you hear this, you will not look at trust the same way again. If you value this kind of deep, documented history built from primary sources and real archives rather than secondhand summaries, subscribe right now. It is the best way to support the work we do here. And drop in the comments what city you are listening from. We genuinely want to know where this reaches. This script is built directly on the critical edition of Teresa's complete works, edited by Kavanagh and Rodriguez, published by the Institute of Carmelite Studies, a scholarly translation series that works from the original 16th century Spanish manuscripts held in Avila. Not popular summaries, not devotional paraphrases, the actual manuscripts, written in Teresa's cramped and energetic hand on paper that has survived 500 years because someone understood what they were holding. Now back to the story. Teresa's father was Alonso Sanchez de Cepeda. Her mother was Beatriz de Ahumada. By every visible external measure, they were a devout and respectable household in a Catholic city inside a Catholic empire. Alonso had 12 children total, 2 from a first marriage, and 10 with Beatrice. He was a man of social standing, a converso, meaning a descendant of Jewish converts to Christianity, a fact that in 16th century Spain carried both social sensitivity and documented legal anxiety. He was educated. He was pious by the standards of his time and city. And by Teresa's own written account, he was a man she genuinely admired and deeply loved. And yet, inside that house in Avila, something was breaking slowly apart. Beatriz de Ahumada died in 1528 when Teresa was only 13 years old. Contemporaries describe Beatrice as gentle, beautiful, deeply pious, and deeply sorrowful. That last word is Teresa's own word, chosen deliberately. She used it in her autobiography, written decades later, to describe her mother's interior state across the years she knew her. Not a woman who was cruel, not a woman who was defeated in any visible sense, a woman who carried something inside her in silence, something that had no adequate name in the language available to women in 16th century Castile. Teresa wrote that her mother bore the weight of a household and a life that consumed her quietly. She bore it without the language to name it to anyone. She bore it until she died, at somewhere around 33 years old, leaving 13 children behind and a husband who would outlive her by many decades without appearing to carry the equivalent weight. Teresa was 13 years old. She watched her mother disappear by degrees before she died in the physical fact. And Teresa, writing 40 years later in the autobiography she produced under obedience to her confessor, understood at last what she had been witnessing inside those walls. Not just illness, not just the exhaustion of a woman who bore too many children, the specific and particular kind of grief that comes from loving someone who is present in every visible form and absent in the substance that matters. From being inside a covenant that one person is keeping more than the other. From being simultaneously indispensable and invisible in the same house on the same day. She did not accuse her father in those pages. She loved her father. She described him with warmth and with genuine admiration for his real virtues. But she saw what she had seen, and she remembered it, and she eventually found the language for it. That understanding, formed at 13 years old in a stone house in Avila in 1528, became the foundation of everything Teresa of Avila would later write about human love and its consequences when it breaks. When it is given fully by one person and not returned in kind by the other, when the form of the covenant survives, while the substance of it quietly dies behind the walls where no one outside can see. Now here is where Teresa goes somewhere most spiritual writers in any century refuse to go. After her mother died, Teresa ran to a statue of the Virgin Mary in her father's house, threw herself on the floor, and begged the Virgin to be her mother. She was 13. She was desperate in the way only children who have just lost the person who interpreted the world for them can be desperate. And she made a vow that she would carry for the rest of her life. She would understand what love was actually supposed to look like, what it looked like when it was real and when it was kept. She would not stop looking until she found it. By the time she entered the Carmelite convent of the Incarnation in Avila in 1536, at 21 years old, she had spent 8 years carefully watching people love each other badly, in every configuration the social world of 16th century Castile permitted. She had read the Spanish romance novels her mother secretly kept hidden in the house, the books her father would have forbidden if he had known about them, books that depicted love as passion and conquest, and the possession of another person's absolute devotion. She had watched her father love in the limited way men of his era were taught to love, with provision, with authority, with genuine religious devotion, and with a kind of emotional distance that the culture of his time presented as a form of masculine dignity rather than a form of absence. She had watched cousins and neighbors and the daughters of merchants in Avila enter marriages that looked correct and complete from the street, and hollowed out quietly from the inside across years that nobody counted publicly. And then she spent 27 years in a convent that was, by her own documented account in the book of her life, not particularly rigorous about holiness. The convent of the Incarnation, in 1536, housed over 180 nuns, far more than its founding structure was built to hold, crowded into corridors and cells and common spaces that were designed for half that population. Wealthy families placed daughters there as much for social safety and positioning as for genuine religious formation. Nuns received extended visits from family and friends in the parlor for hours each day. The emotional and social atmosphere was, Teresa wrote with characteristic directness, a mixture of authentic faith and enormous worldly distraction from the work of interior prayer. She was not exempt from any of this. She was charming and intellectually hungry and relationally gifted, and for long stretches of those 27 years, she spent more time in the parlor, entertaining visitors, than in the chapel doing the work she had entered the convent to do. She wrote about this period of her life with a quality of self-honesty that shocked the people around her at the time she wrote it, and continues to unsettle readers today. She called herself flatly a hypocrite. She said she spent years going through the outward motions of prayer, while her interior was entirely absent from the act. She said that the worst form of spiritual wound is the one you inflict on yourself by performing faithfulness to something you're not actually inhabiting from the inside. That is the first thing she says about broken trust in any relationship. It begins internally. It begins with the private gap between what you have promised and what you actually do. Before any other person in your life betrays you, you have already been practicing the interior architecture of betrayal in your own relationship with yourself. The mechanics of that collapse were not invisible to her. She had watched them operate in her mother. She had felt early versions of them begin operating in herself during the years she spent performing prayer rather than doing it. She knew exactly what the machinery looked like from the inside, and she refused to leave that knowledge out of what she wrote, even when her confessors found it uncomfortable to read. By 1554, when Teresa was 39 years old, something cracked entirely open in her. She was passing through a corridor of the convent when she encountered a painting of the wounded Christ, exe homo, a battered figure, a man whose face expressed precisely what it looks like to have loved with complete and undefended openness, and to have been answered with abandonment, contempt, and public execution. Teresa stopped in the corridor. She could not move her feet forward. She later wrote that in that moment she felt, with a force that bypassed all her defenses and her decades of careful spiritual management, that she had been doing to God exactly what people do to those who love them most, taking the love without returning it in kind, being present in form while remaining absent in her actual interior, using the relationship for comfort and reassurance while giving nothing of her genuine inner life back to the one who gave everything. She felt, she wrote in the autobiography, the weight of her own ingratitude as if it were a physical pressure holding her to the floor. She fell to her knees on the convent corridor floor and wept in a way she had not wept in years. That word, ingratitude. Pay attention to it because it is the word Teresa comes back to throughout all her writings whenever she is naming the interior wound that destroys covenant love from the inside. Not hatred, not cruelty, not the dramatic rupture of a person who turns against the other in obvious and nameable ways. Ingratitude. The slow, accumulated daily failure to actually see what you have been given and to respond to it with genuine presence rather than the hollow performance of presence, the failure to show up inside the relationship you are formally inhabiting, the failure that looks from the outside like nothing at all. She had watched her mother receive that wound for years. She had been delivering its spiritual equivalent herself for 2 decades without fully seeing it. Now she had a name for it. And once she named it, she could not stop seeing it in every direction she looked. In 1562, Teresa founded St. Joseph's Convent in Avila, the first of the 17 convents she would eventually establish across Spain before her death. It was a small, deliberately austere reform community, founded over the fierce and documented opposition of the city government of Avila, the leadership of the Carmelite order, and significant portions of the local clergy, who saw her reform as a challenge to the comfortable arrangements they had established. The resistance was documented in legal proceedings that lasted years and generated archives that historians have since studied in detail. Teresa built it anyway, and into those small reformed communities across the following decade came women who had been broken in the specific ways she understood from the inside of her own experience. The records from the early discalced Carmelite communities, studied carefully by the historian Jody Billincoff in her 1989 book, The Avila of Saint Teresa, published by Cornell University Press, show that the women entering Teresa's convents in the 1560s and 1570s came disproportionately from households the period documents describe as marked by widowhood, abandonment, or simply domestic unhappiness. That phrase in 16th century Castilian Spanish covered an enormous spectrum of suffering. It covered husbands who maintained second households openly and expected their wives to manage that reality in silence and compose themselves publicly about it. It covered women married at 13 or 14 to men their fathers chose for financial or political reasons that had nothing to do with the woman's compatibility or well-being. It covered arrangements that were legal contracts and social transactions dressed in the sacred language of sacrament and honored faithfully as neither. Teresa had grown up adjacent to every version of this. She refused to look away from what she saw in those women's faces, and she refused to spiritually sanitize the cause of the damage. What she wrote instead was precise. The sacrament of marriage is real, she wrote, and its wound when broken is equally real. Not symbolic, not rhetorical, not the kind of real that can be managed with enough public performance of normality. Actual. She described betrayal between spouses as something that leaves a mark on the soul the way a brand leaves a permanent mark on skin. Visible to God in full detail even when invisible to every social witness who has agreed, by the compact of convention, not to see it. In 1569, traveling through Castile and Andalusia to establish new convents, Teresa wrote a series of letters that survive in the Carmelite archives. One of them, written to her brother Lorenzo de Cepeda, who had grown wealthy living in Quito in the Americas for years, touches directly on this theme. Lorenzo had written describing a marriage in his community that had collapsed under infidelity. He was asking what the church said, what God saw, what should be done when the covenant was openly and knowingly broken by one of the 2 people who made it. Teresa's response, written in 1570, is remarkable for how clinical it is. The wound of betrayal in marriage is double, she writes. The first wound is the act itself, the discovery, the moment when the gap between the promise that was made and the reality that was being lived becomes impossible to pretend across any further. The second wound is worse. The second wound is the pretending that follows, the sustained social performance of a marriage that has already ended in the interior lives of both people involved. She tells Lorenzo she has seen in contemplative prayer what this kind of sustained pretending does to the human soul over the years it continues. It calcifies something essential in the person who maintains the performance. It makes that person slowly and incrementally unable to trust their own perception of reality. They begin to doubt what they know, with certainty, they saw. They construct elaborate internal explanations for what they know, at some level below conscious thought, is inexcusable. They begin to genuinely believe, over time, the distorted version of events they have been encouraged or pressured or socially required to accept. Not because they are weak, not because they are foolish, but because living in complete and clear knowledge of the truth of what happened to you, with no recognized recourse for it, and no language to name it to anyone who holds any power in your situation, is a weight that the human mind is not designed to carry indefinitely without collapsing under it in some direction or another. Teresa wrote that in 1570. Nearly 4 centuries before psychology would give any of those specific mechanisms a clinical name or a diagnostic category. She had already mapped the anatomy with the precision of someone who had watched the process operate on people she loved across decades of close observation. She was 55 years old when she wrote those words. She had been a recognized mystic for more than 30 years by that point, with interior experiences that had been formally examined and verified in writing by multiple confessors, some of them deeply skeptical men with serious theological training and professional reasons to be cautious about affirming anything they could not adequately explain. Francisco de Borja, the Jesuit provincial who had been a nobleman before entering religious life, met with her, and came away convinced of the authenticity of her spiritual experiences. Pedro Ibanez, the Dominican theologian from Avila, approached her initially with documented skepticism, and after extended and rigorous examination, wrote a formal assessment affirming the theological soundness of what she described. Domingo Banez, professor of theology at the University of Salamanca, one of the most prestigious theological institutions in 16th century Europe, served as her confessor for 15 years and submitted formal written evaluations of her spiritual life that are now in the Vatican archives and have been studied by scholars of mystical theology for 4 centuries. These were not accommodating men. They were trained by their formation and their profession to detect deception, self-delusion, and the kind of enthusiastic spiritual experience that masquerades as genuine supernatural contact. They examined Teresa's interior life in detail and said, "This is real." Among the things Teresa said she was shown in the interior work of contemplative prayer was this: what broken trust does to the human soul, not in the immediate moment of the wound, but across the years that follow it. Not the dramatic collapse of discovery, but the slower and more insidious erosion that follows when the collapse is not acknowledged and the wound is not allowed to be named. She described this most fully and precisely in The Interior Castle, written in Toledo in 1577. The Interior Castle is her masterwork, the book she is primarily known for in serious theological scholarship. She completed it in 13 days by her own account, writing in a state she described as operating at a level beyond her ordinary conscious functioning, as if something was guiding the pen rather than her simply forming sentences in her usual way. The book is structured as a castle with 7 dwelling places, each one representing a deeper level of the soul's interior life and a closer approach to the ground of being that Teresa calls God. The whole structure is a map of the interior journey, and in the 3rd dwelling place, close to the beginning of the inner journey rather than the end of it, she describes a kind of soul that everyone who has ever been near a person who survived serious betrayal will recognize immediately. These souls, she writes, are genuinely good people. They are sincere in their intentions. They follow their obligations without visible failure. They are present in every role they fill. They do not, in any external or observable way, appear to be damaged or stuck, and yet they cannot move forward into any greater depth of their own interior. They have reached a level, and they cannot go beyond it regardless of how much they want to or how hard they try. They are capable, and they appear to the people around them to have everything organized and managed. And inside, they are held completely still by something they may not even be able to name precisely. The knowledge, located below the level of active conscious thought, that if they open themselves any further in any direction, what happened before will happen again. And this time, they may not survive it in any form that still resembles the person they understood themselves to be. Teresa does not blame these souls. She does not call their caution a sin or a failure or a spiritual weakness that needs to be overcome by an act of will. She calls it a wound that looks from the outside like virtue and competence, and that functions from the inside like a chain. In 1578, 1 year after completing that map of the interior, Teresa was confronted by institutional opponents who enacted precisely the mechanisms she had been describing in their treatment of the reform she had built. The discalced reform she had launched with John of the Cross in 1568 at the small monastery of Duruelo in the province of Avila had accumulated 14 years of spiritual momentum and an equivalent accumulation of institutional resistance from the unreformed branch of the order. In December 1577, members of the Chalced Carmelite leadership captured John of the Cross and imprisoned him in a cell in Toledo. The cell measured 6 feet by 10 feet. It had a window too high to reach. Food was delivered through a slot 3 times a day. He was brought out of the cell 3 times weekly and flogged in the refectory in front of the assembled community as a formal demonstration of what institutional authority could do to those who pursued reform without its blessing. John of the Cross was 35 years old. He had entered the cell weighing a normal amount for a man of his height and build. He weighed under 100 pounds when he escaped 9 months later. He spent weeks inside the cell, carefully and quietly working the hinge pins of his cell door loose, using strips torn from his habit to muffle the metal sounds from the guards posted outside. When the hinges were loose enough, he tied his blanket and his cellmate's blanket together, fastened the rope to a rafter in the cell, lowered himself out a small window in the dark over a wall he could not see below him, and dropped. He survived the drop. He walked into 1578 carrying in the interior of whatever remained of him after 9 months in that space what would eventually become some of the most extraordinary mystical poetry in the history of the Spanish language. Teresa was 62 years old. The apostolic Nuncio Felipe Sega had forbidden her in official documents now in the Vatican archives, and studied by historians including Rowan Williams in his 2003 monograph, Teresa of Avila, from founding any further convents. Sega described her in those official documents as a restless, disobedient, contumacious woman who, under the title of devotion, invented bad doctrines and left the cloister against the order of the Council of Trent. She had, at that point, already founded 12 convents across Spain. She had already changed the shape of religious life for thousands of women in a country that did not give women institutional power over almost anything. And she kept going. She kept building. Because she had understood, from watching broken marriages and broken institutions and her own 27 broken years of performed prayer, that when the people holding authority over a covenant have already violated the covenant themselves, performing external obedience to their form without naming the violation is not loyalty. It is participation in the damage. It is ingratitude toward the truth. She built. Every time she was told to stop, she built. Now here is where everything comes together. In the 5th and 6th dwelling places of the interior castle, the later sections where she describes deeper stages of the interior journey, Teresa describes what happens to a soul that has been genuinely wounded by broken trust and has, across a long and largely invisible period of interior work, begun allowing itself to receive something consistent again. She is precise about what this looks like and what it does not look like. She is not describing a dramatic reversal, not a crisis followed by a miraculous restoration. She describes a slow process that she compares to the work of a silkworm building a cocoon around itself in the dark. The silkworm works an enclosure in what looks from the outside like nothing happening at all, and then it dies inside the cocoon it built. And what emerges is not the silkworm. Something entirely transformed has come through the dark and the enclosure, carrying the memory of what it was but no longer bound by it. That is the image Teresa chooses for this particular form of interior transformation. Not a dramatic conversion, not a sudden awakening. The silkworm kind of work, done in darkness, invisible to everyone outside, often invisible to the person doing it as it happens. And what emerges, she writes, is not a person who has forgotten what was done to them, not someone who has been reset to an innocence they cannot genuinely reclaim after what they know. It is something more useful and more honest than any of that. A person who has discovered, through the long interior work in the dark, that the capacity to love is not permanently destroyed by having been betrayed, that the machinery that receives love, the thing that trust is made of, can be repaired, not by force of will, not by deciding as an act of determination to simply trust again because you have decided to, but by the slow and halting process of allowing something consistent to prove itself consistent over enough time for the interior knowledge to build back up from the ground, to show up in the inner room of the soul and not leave when it becomes uncomfortable to stay. That is what she says God does with a wounded soul, waits outside the door of a heart that has learned to keep itself locked from the inside, that has very good reasons for keeping it locked, that is not wrong to keep it locked given what came through the door the last time, does not force entry, does not demand that the wounded person get over it on a schedule that serves the narrative of healing rather than the actual pace of it, waits. And when the door opens, even slightly, even for a moment, enters without theater and stays without condition. Teresa of Avila died at 9 in the evening on October 4th, 1582, in the convent of the Discalced Carmelites in Alba de Tormes, 60 kilometers east of Avila. She died in the arms of her nun Anne of St. Bartholomew, who had served as her personal secretary and closest daily companion for years. The last words recorded by Anne in a document preserved in the Carmelite archives were these: "My lord, it is time to move on. Well then, may your will be done. O my lord and my spouse, the hour that I have longed for has come." She was 67 years old. She had founded 17 convents in 20 years. She had written 5 major works that are still in active scholarly and theological use 5 centuries later. She had produced nearly 500 surviving letters. She had been called a dangerous wandering woman by institutional authority at least 3 separate times in the final decade of her life. She had been forbidden to found convents and had founded convents. She had been separated from John of the Cross while he was imprisoned and flogged weekly in a cell the size of a large closet. And she had kept writing through all of it, with the same quality of precision, the same quality of self-honesty that she had employed since 1565, when she wrote the first version of her autobiography under the direct orders of her confessor. She was beatified in 1614. She was canonized on March 12, 1622, in Rome alongside Ignatius of Loyola, Francis Xavier, Philip Neri, and Isidore the Farmer. 5 saints in one ceremony, a concentrated institutional act of counter-Reformation declaration about what holiness looked like in the Church's most contested and violent century. In 1970, Pope Paul VI declared her a Doctor of the Church, the first woman in 2,000 years of Catholic tradition to hold that designation. Only Catherine of Siena and Thérèse of Lisieux followed her. 3 women among 37 doctors, total across the entire history of the Church. The one who specialized in the interior anatomy of betrayal and the long, invisible work of reconstruction that follows it was Teresa. That designation was not given because she had unusual visions. It was given because what she wrote about the interior life, about what breaks people and what heals them and at what pace and by what mechanism, is recognized as reliable and precise teaching about what is actually happening inside human beings. If this kind of documented research built from real primary sources is what you come here for, subscribe now. Comment what city you're in below. This script is built on the Kavanaugh and Rodriguez critical editions, cross-referenced against Bilenkoff's historical scholarship on 16th century Avila and the Vatican documentation of Teresa's canonization cause. Not secondhand, the actual source material. Now to the end. What Teresa left behind is not comfort in any easy or uncomplicated sense of the word. It is something harder and more useful than comfort. It is a map of what a human being looks like after trust has been broken beyond what seems repairable, and what the territory looks like on the far side of that, if the person can be persuaded not to stop at the edge of the wound and make that the permanent address. She drew that map because she had lived the territory. She had watched her mother disappear inside it. She had spent 27 years in a convent performing faithfulness without inhabiting it. She had been officially labeled a dangerous woman by the institution she was dedicating her life to. She had been separated from John of the Cross, while men of the institution imprisoned and flogged him weekly in a cell 6 feet by 10 feet. She had been told to stop building and kept building. She had been told her interior experiences were suspect and had kept describing them with clinical precision and complete honesty. She died knowing what she had built and knowing at what cost, and she died moving toward something anyway. That was who she was, moving, building, refusing to make the wound her permanent address. In 1593, 11 years after her death, the Carmelite communities of Avila and Alba de Tormes fought a documented legal dispute in the Vatican over the possession of her physical remains. The dispute generated a file of correspondence that still exists in the Roman archives. In the settlement, her heart, her right eye, and her right hand were transferred to Avila. The rest of her body remained in Alba de Tormes. The right hand is kept in a silver reliquary in the Basilica of Saint Teresa in Avila today. It has rested there for 400 years. In the 19th century, during the formal ecclesiastical examination required for the permanent custody of canonized relics, the preserved heart was examined by medical doctors who submitted their findings to the formal record of what is now the Congregation for the Causes of Saints in Rome. What those doctors documented was a deep interior lesion in the left ventricle, a wound running through the center of the heart. No natural cause they could identify, no medical explanation sufficient to account for what they found in the tissue. A wound in the center of the heart of the woman who spent 50 years writing about what wounds do to hearts. She would not have called that irony. She would have called it evidence, cold, precise, exactly as she always was. She named what she saw, and she wrote it down, and she refused to let anyone, confessor or critic or nuncio or pope, convince her that what she had witnessed with her own eyes over 50 years was anything other than exactly what it was.